Alrighty, welcome to my second Blender tutorial. So I've been looking at something called Parallax Occlusion mapping. It's a rather fascinating little camera trick to fake depth mapping where there isn't any. But I noticed that there aren't too many tutorials that sort of focus on it, and certainly none that I could see that dealt with procedural displacement using parallax mapping. So I thought I'd take a little dive into that. Now, for those who don't know, Eevee rather famously doesn't support vector displacement. You're forced to rely on either geometry nodes or the modifier, displace modifier, right, in Eevee. Neither of which can be used to drive color at the same time they drive displacement, which is the main draw of it. So the next best thing is a little something called parallax mapping, and it looks a little something like this. Okay? So you can see, even though the plane is just a plane, we've got some actual depth going for us, right? Depth that we can use as a mask for other attributes. So without parallax, for comparison, this is what you would have, right? It'd be completely flat, right? You got a very intricate bump map, but that's kind of it. It's just flat. But once you start adding parallax, you can see you quickly start getting some depth, right? Now, I want to make clear there are limitations to this trick, right? For those who are hoping for really tall mountains or deep valleys, I'm afraid you're out of luck. That's not going to happen, right? This is not a linear effect. So eventually, even if you crank it, you'll just start to approach infinity. All right? It's not going to work. And there are limitations with the angle as well. Like eventually, if you go too low an angle, yeah, you just lose it. But otherwise, it holds up pretty well, even at fairly low angles. It does pretty well, and you can see even the light is pooling in the depth where it's deep. So, without further ado, I'll show you how I made this. I'll show you how I make it. So, I'm gonna get rid of this and make a new one. And we'll start from scratch. Okay, so let's come into the shading workspace here, and let's get started. So parallax mapping at its most basic is really just the act of subtracting the incoming vector from the position vector, right? At its most basic, that's all it really is. It's actually not much more complicated than that, in a way. So for example, if I were to get a vector map and change it to subtract, right? Take our position, and then subtract away our incoming, you'll end up with something like this. Okay? Now it doesn't look like much to begin with, although for the eagle-eyed you may already notice that the origin is already slightly offset from the original. So if we were to increase that effect, right, by say scaling it, let's use a scale mode here, change it to scale, then you can see, right, the vector position starts to disappear inside the plane. Right? And that's really the basis of the trick, so to speak. You're just subtracting an incoming vector from the position to make it look like mapping has sunk into the plane. Okay? So let's move this back a little bit. So instead of using just a vector map, what if we did something that was a little more mask friendly? So we use Shift S to change this from a vector to a mix RGB. Okay? But instead of mix, still going to set it as subtract. Okay, and now we've got a mask to play with. Well, now we've got a factor we can use, right, to drive the effect. So if I were to use, say, something like a Musgrave texture or any procedural texture to drive the factor, then we get some distinction, right? We start to get a little bit of distinction between subtraction and the original generated coordinates, which are just centered to the plane, anchored to the plane. Right, so I'm just going to set this to hybrid multifractal, set this to about 8, and yeah, don't really need to play with these too much. I like to turn the dimension down a little bit, clarity up a little bit, but you don't really need to worry about this too much. That's not the main thing. The main thing is, if we were to run this into, say, another procedural texture, like a noise, for example, now we've got some distinction. Now, initially, this is going to look incredibly distorted, right? We've got our separation, but it looks really, really distorted, right? See that straight away. So we need to do a couple more things to offset this basically. This is mainly to the moment just because the scale is so high. If I set this to 1, you can see the effect isn't anywhere near so violent. Right, it's just as soon as you crank it, yeah, it starts to distort really badly in either direction. It doesn't really matter whether you're going up or down. Yeah. So we don't want that. We want to have a little more freedom than stuck between, this and this. So to fix this bit of offsetting, or to fix this distortion, we're going to offset it a little bit. Okay. So the way I do that is I get myself another math node. Set the math node here. I'm just going to drop it right there. And I usually set this to about 2.3, 2.4, like that. Right. Now initially that's going to look like it's not really doing anything. It's not yet. But what we can do is we can do Shift D and another vector math node. And instead of add, I'm going to set it to power. And instead of a positive number, I'm going to set it to a negative number, 2. Right. And now, if we crank the scale, it doesn't end up suffering quite so much. Now, we'll start to distort again eventually, but we can offset this with these two, right? So I can bring this down a little bit, and also bring this up a little bit. We start to fix our distortion, but at least have less of it. That's the main thing. You can see now we've got the basis of our parallax mapping, parallax displacement. Okay, you can actually see there's an actual stepping between the different amounts of displacement, right? There's actual distinction between the two. So you can play with this as much as you like. I tend to not play with it too much. It looks quite distorted in here, but once you start running it through the shader, it becomes even less noticeable. So, and also, I'm going to turn this down a little bit. You'll find a little goes a long way when it comes to parallaxy as well, sort of thing. So cranking these up isn't super necessary. Yeah, a little goes a long way when it comes to the scale of the procedural textures. But that's the basis of it, really. It's not much more complicated than that. So let's have some fun with it. Now, one thing I should note before we continue is this really only works with 3D procedural textures, right? If you try to set this to 2D, I'm afraid, yeah, you'll get this, right? It'll stretch rather badly. Basically for the same reason that UVs that are on top of each other, right, causes stretching along the axis of that face, those faces. Yeah, so it needs 3 dimensions in order to understand 3 vectors of positioning, 3 inputs of vector positioning. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. All right, so now let's move this back. I'm going to move this back a little bit, give ourselves some space. Okay. Let's use this to create the terrain we had before, right? Let's use this to actually create our terrain. So actually put it to practical use. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give myself a color ramp. Okay, drop that right here. I'm going to drop factor into here, drop color into here. I'm going to turn this back on. Okay. Give it a moment to recompile, which you'll be doing more and more. And let's give ourselves some colors to work with. Okay. So I'm going to set this to maybe reddish brown color. Doesn't need to be super bright. It's going to be on land. Something like that. This one we can make not quite so dark. Maybe something like a dark brown. It's up. Here maybe a little bit. And maybe make this a little more, I don't know, reddish orange. Oh, give it a little more contrast. Maybe one more. Down a little bit, and then maybe one more. Here. It's down again. Maybe something like more golden, brownish, more of a sandy color. Yeah, you can play with these whatever you like. Sort of just a rocky. You want a sort of a rocky, rough terrain. Cool. Lovely. I'm happy with that. So, something else, a little trick I like to do to give myself a really craggy surface, like a really sort of rough, craggy surface. Not only do I turn up the detail of this, which already a good start, something like that, but I also like to drop a Voronoi in. Okay. But instead of the color, I use the distance instead. Okay. That starts to make it look really sort of rough and craggy. I also like to drop a value node in and use that for the scale of both of them. I find this actually helps. They have the same scale. Yeah. You get some very interesting effects as soon as you start to scale it up. A little bit overpowering some of these. Yeah, I like that maybe a little bit more. Quite so tense. Cool. But yeah, you can see it starts to look much rougher and much craggier. Is what I like. So let's make more use of that. Right, so I'm going to get myself a vector bump and take the distance again, drop it into the height, take the normal, drop it into the normal, like so. Oh, that's really, really strong. Turn that down a little bit. But yeah, nice and rough. Cool. Okay, so that'll do for our landscape. You can always play with it a little bit more if you want, or whatever looks good to you. Well, it's kind of interesting. Whatever looks interesting to you. I like that actually. Whatever looks good. So now that we've got that, let's separate it. Right? So we need to separate our land from our water. Okay. So we need a mask. We need to make use of some masking to do that. So your mask is actually here, functionally, right? So if I were to get another color ramp, wait for this to recompile, okay? Build another color ramp, take this, plug it into here, control like that. So if you're noticing some harsh lines, some quite heavy distinction between, the two displacements, the valleys and the peaks, that's actually down to the detail of your shape of your texture, right? If it has detail. So notice as soon as I change it, yeah, it shifts between the amount of harshness. So I usually leave it about 4, right? And then you can play with the dimension and the lacunarity to get that distinction, to play with how detailed the differences are. But the main thing is we still need a distinct gradient. Okay, so this isn't going to serve us actually too well in terms of separating land from water. So we need to harshen it up a little bit. We do that by just crunching our color ramp. Okay, so bring this all the way in, and depending how deep you want the water, like that's probably good. And bring that all the way in. So you want to bring them quite close to each other, but not too close, at least not for our purposes, because you do want this. Okay, you do want this gradient, this transitional gradient here, because that's going to be the beachhead later on. That's going to be your sand. Okay, so don't bring them too close, but you still want them fairly close, so that there is a sharp distinction, at least some sharp distinction between land and water. Now, counterintuitively, somewhat counterintuitively, the white is actually going to be the depth not the black. I know that's sort of not what we're used to, but yeah, the white. The white is actually where the parallaxy is strongest, if you want to think of it that way. So that's actually what's going to sink into the ground. Yeah, it sort of threw me the first time as well, but yeah. You can invert the color ramp if you really want to. That doesn't make sense to you, but it doesn't ultimately doesn't really matter, right? You just, as long as they're separated, that's what we really care about. So what we need now is a mix RGB, which I'm going to drop right here, and I'm going to put this into bottom one, I believe, top one, and this I'm just going to make a bluish color, something like that. Yeah, that'll probably do. Maybe bring the value down a little bit more. Take this, plug it into that, and let's take a look. Cool. There you have it. So, we've got some water-ish, well, at least a basic water color. Let's separate everything else now as well. So I'm going to want different height maps, different strengths as well for our water. So I'm going to do Control-Shift-D on this noise texture. And I'm just going to cut this. I actually don't want that. That's separate. And for water, I generally have the low detail, really, and fairly high roughness, and just a smidge distortion. Very, very little, otherwise it will just look awful. But that's all I really do for water. So again, let's mix this and do Control-Shift-D down here. Once again, I'm going to cut that because I actually don't want that. We take this one, plug it into the bottom one, and we take this one, plug it into the top one, take that, plug it into the height. And then wait for it to recompile. And this starts to take longer and longer than what? Yeah, cool. So now we've got our water surface, right? Now it's way too intense. It's actually way too, the bump is way too, the strength is way too high. But it is roughly the right height of the land. So I want different strength maps as well as different height maps. Okay, I actually want, yeah, two different ones. So let's copy this as well. Okay. Now let's plug the same thing into here. Same thing. Just gonna get rid of this and this because we don't need any of that. And the value about 0.1 usually. And this one we can leave at 0.7, which is basically what that is. Okay, we take that, plug it into the strength. You don't have to copy these values exactly, obviously. These are just preferences for me. You can do whatever makes you look good. Yeah, okay, whatever makes it look good. That's much better. All right, you don't want it too intense along the water surface. Otherwise, yeah, you don't want it too intense along the water surface. Otherwise, it really conflicts with the transparency and reflectivity that we're going to be adding in later on. Okay, so yeah, something just to keep in mind. That's looking good so far. So let's add that. So let's add the water's other functions, other features, right? So water is obviously also partially transparent and it's also very reflective. So we need to add that in. So we can actually, it's fairly simple actually, we can just take our mask again and plug it straight into the transmission, like so. Nothing too complicated. Just take a moment, and there we go. That's already looking heaps better. Nice. Nice. Yeah, that looks good. It's looking fairly good. Yeah, it'll look better. Let's not play with that too much, otherwise we'll be here all day. So, let's do that as well. Now, if you want murkier water, right, if you want sort of murkier water, you can play with the transmission roughness. See, that gives you murkier water if you want. Or, and it is either or, you can switch this to multiscatter UVX. Now I find the multiscatter UVX is a bit better, a bit more accurate. I tend to like its look a bit more, but it's a matter of personal preference. The only thing about that though is if you change it to multiscatter, you will lose the transmission roughness. Right? It's as simple as that. Oh, and you should set the IL to 1.3 because that's the actual refractive index of water. It's a minor thing, but it's worth doing. Cool. So that's looking pretty good, but we still want roughness, right? We still need to get the reflectivity, which is a big part of water. So let's get a invert node. Well, I'm going to drop that right here because we actually want the inverse of this mask. We want the land to be really rough and our water to be really smooth. So we actually need the opposite, right? We need our water to be black and our land to be white. And then we take that, take it into our roughness. Give that a moment to compile, which is going to take longer and longer. As we get more intensive, yeah. Okay, cool. Alrighty. Oh, that's looking nice. Good. Cool. So, I'll turn down this a little bit more, to be honest. Just want some subtle ones. Cool. And that just leaves the specular. So the specular you can just turn right down. Honestly, with specular, yeah, once you start messing with transmission, specularity seems to lose all meaning. So the water will actually not be affected by specular, which just leaves the land, and the land we don't want to specular anyway because it's rough, craggy ground. So I'm just going to leave that really. Yeah. Nice. So now that we've sorted all that out, the only thing left, I would say, really, is the sand. Oh, and the lighting. Yes. So as you probably noticed by now, the lighting is very flat across the surface. Even though there's supposed to be some depth, you can see the light reflects across the water as though it is perfectly planar. And if that's what you're going for, then by all means keep it like that. But chances are you do actually want lighting to coordinate with parallaxing, right, with the actual peaking and troughing of the surface. So to do that, we need a displacement. Not this one. This is actually the wrong displacement. It's actually no good to us. Right? I'm just going to show you why. Because this actually can't help us. This single stream data, yeah, it's no good for what we want. Have tried. What we actually need is vector displacement. Yeah, we need this one, right? Not this one. Bring that over here, where it's more easily accessed by our mask. And take, no, not our mask, sorry, not our mask. With our coordinates, we actually need to use our vector coordinates, okay? We're going to take our triple stream vector information from here and plug it into our triple stream socket down here. Right? Now we take our displacement, plug it into here, let that recompile. Any moment now. Any moment, there we go. And now the lighting actually pools in the water, right? So now the lighting actually, yeah, bounces across the water surface, or actually it pools in the cavity that is the water area, which is what you want, right? Now you can tweak this, so you can turn this down by all means, make it flat again, but as you can see, yeah. If you crank it, yeah, it's just going to look really weird after a while. This is not a linear effect, like I said, right? Yeah, so more in Higher numbers just mean more intense, not better. Okay, so usually a value of 1, maybe 1.1 tops, right? I wouldn't go much higher than that. Cool. So, good so far, good so far. What does that leave us with? Oh, the beach. Yes. Well, the last bit obviously is the beachhead itself. Okay? So obviously we need to separate. We need to separate our this bit here. We need to isolate, not separate, but isolate. We need to isolate this gradient, right? Which is easily done with a color ramp. Once again. So let's take this, plug it into here. I'm gonna set this to B spline, and let's just move these back somewhere here. Let's just do a Control-Shift click on this so we can see what we're looking at. And first thing I'm going to do is make 2 more of these. Here. Bring this up to white. Bring this one down to black. Go. One way. And same thing with this one. Make this white. Black. Okay. So you can see now this gives us control over the gradient, right? Over the actual sand gradient. Right? Now you do want to make sure these black ones stay off the edge. If you, in B-spline, if you keep them right up here, see how it turns grey? You don't want that. Right, so make sure these black sliders stay off the edge of the color ramp. That's fine. You can bring them up a little if you want to drive back the gradient. It's entirely up to you. Depends how thin you want the sandbars to be, the beachheads to be. But something like that looks good. Okay, that'll do. We'll go for our beach. So let's move these back. And let's get ourselves another mix RGB. Put that into there. Take our new mask. Drop that into there. And let's set this to a sand color. So I'm going to bring it something like that, maybe sandy color. Maybe just make it a little bit brighter. Sort of golden sand color. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, see what that looks like. Give it a moment to compile. Good, nice. Alright, got ourselves some sand, nice golden sand around the borders. But we're not quite done yet, because we want distinct bump mapping for the sand, just like we have for the water and the rock. So same thing again. Let's get ourselves another mix RGB. I'm just going to duplicate it because we're not actually going to keep any of the original inputs. Going to take our new mask, drop it into the mix factor right there. Okay. And let's take our current bump mapping, take that into the top, and we're going to plug our new sand into the bottom one. So I'm going to use a Voronoi. I like to use a Voronoi texture for sand. Okay. Make sure to keep using the same mapping for everything. Make sure to keep consistent mapping. It's not going to make a world of difference, probably, but yeah, it's good just to keep using the same mapping. And I'm just going to take the color and plug it into there. Right? You'll see why in a sec. So that looks good. That'll do for that. And we just want an addition. Yeah, we just want our own distinct strength as well. So once again, we're going to duplicate a mix RGB. I'm going to take the mask, our new mask. Might just do an alt right click. Probably going to be easiest. There we go. Good. And let's just drop that over here. If you're wondering why you're not seeing anything, I find it faster to just do this without compiling every single time because it just takes forever. Alright, so let's take that, plug it into the top one, And as for our new sand, I'm actually going to have it really high in terms of strength. Something like that will do. Oh, like that will do. Will do for now. Okay, cool. So let's take this into the strength, take this into the height, and we'll just let that compile together. Hopefully be a little bit quicker than doing each of them one at a time. Alright, any second now. Every minute now. Cool. Alright, so obviously the scale is way too big, so let's just start cranking that up. So you imagine each of these is individual sand grains, so that's why we're going to crank it up. Nothing much higher than that. So depending basically how small you want the sands of grain to be, obviously sand being sand, you probably want to crank this right up. I think I usually have them about 500, generally. It's probably good for this sort of thing. If you have it too small, then it kind of just disappears into blurring as well. The effect just kind of fades to infinity. So you want something that looks good at a distance, basically. Looks not microscopic, but looks like grains of sand at a distance. Cool. Alright, that looks good. And you can play with the strength a little bit. I find if you turn the strength up really high, you get a very golden color sometimes. I think it depends on the HDRI. Anyway, doesn't matter. Point is, we have our displacement. Right, our parallax displacement mapping. Right, and all of it is completely procedural. You are free to change the color of anything. You're free to tighten the sand if you want to bring it back a little bit. Actually, other way. There you go. Tighten it up a little bit. Bring it in. Right, you're free to play with any of it. Obviously, you can use different procedural textures. So with any of these settings. Well, I'll let you play with that. Point is, there you go. Okay, so hopefully this was informative. Hopefully, if I keep waffling on, you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, if you learned something, by all means, give me a usual thing. Give me a like and subscribe. And yeah, hopefully I will see you in the next one. Alrighty.